In the freezing dawn of December 16, 1944, the forests of the Ardennes erupted with thunder. For weeks, Allied intelligence had assumed the German army was beaten, incapable of mounting any large-scale offensive. Yet, from the dark timbered hills of eastern Belgium came a storm of artillery unlike anything the American troops had faced since Normandy. From the fog emerged tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers, black crosses glinting faintly on their armor plates. The German counteroffensive had begun. It would be called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. But to the Allies, it would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge. For Hitler, this was no ordinary attack. It was his last roll of the dice, his final attempt to split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. The plan was desperate, almost delusional, yet the Führer believed destiny was once again on his side. The offensive gathered what remained of Germany's strength, 24 divisions including elite SS Panzer units and thousands of inexperienced conscripts barely out of school. They were ordered to break through the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg, crush the U.S. First Army, and capture the vital Meuse River crossings. If they could reach Antwerp, they might drive a wedge between British and American forces, shattering the alliance. The terrain favored the attackers. The Ardennes was a region of dense forests, rolling hills, and narrow roads, terrain the Allies considered unsuitable for major operations. They had used it as a quiet sector for rest and rotation. Many of the American soldiers stationed there were new replacements, untested and ill-prepared for winter combat. The German generals, remembering their 1940 success through the same region, saw opportunity. But this time, their army was running on fumes, fuel shortages, unreliable communications, and an air force crippled by Allied domination of the skies. Still, the attack achieved complete surprise. As dawn broke, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich struck north toward Elsenborn Ridge, while the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel surged west toward Bastogne. The southern flank was guarded by the 7th Army, protecting against Allied counterattacks from Luxembourg. The Germans advanced under cover of fog, muffled engines growling through the pines. American sentries were taken completely off guard. In the small villages dotting the region, places like Losheimer Graben, Büllingen, and St. Vith, confused and outnumbered GIs tried to resist, but the shock was overwhelming. Entire regiments vanished, communications collapsed, and panic spread through the front lines. By the afternoon of December 16th, the German offensive had punched a 50-mile hole in the Allied front. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, wounded men, and burning supply trucks. American commanders scrambled to respond, unsure whether this was a limited attack or a full-scale breakthrough. Eisenhower, at his headquarters in Versailles, received conflicting reports. Some officers even believed the Germans were trying to surrender. But by nightfall, it was clear. This was no small raid. It was a massive counteroffensive. The Bulge was forming. For the German soldiers, spirits soared. Many believed this was the miracle they had been promised. Officers told them the offensive would end the war by Christmas. Propaganda leaflets promised that once Antwerp was taken, the Allies would collapse in disarray. But behind the enthusiasm lurked exhaustion. The veterans of Normandy and the Eastern Front knew better. They had seen the endless Allied bombers, the fuel depots reduced to ashes, the cities turned to rubble. Yet they obeyed. They fought not for victory, but for survival, for their comrades beside them, and for a homeland crumbling behind them. Among the advancing units was Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite SS formation under Joachim Peiper, famed for his ruthlessness and speed. His column of Tiger and Panther tanks cut deep into American lines, capturing fuel dumps and executing prisoners along the way. To the Germans, Piper symbolized the ferocity of the offensive. To the Allies, he would soon become a name synonymous with war crimes. His advance was swift, but costly. Every mile consumed fuel they did not have. Without captured American gasoline, the offensive would stall. In those first days, confusion reigned. The weather favored the Germans. Heavy clouds grounded Allied aircraft, and snowstorms masked their movements. The U.S. 106th Infantry Division was encircled and destroyed, thousands taken prisoner. German commandos in American uniforms infiltrated Allied lines, sowing chaos, changing road signs, and spreading false orders. The entire Allied command structure trembled as rumors of sabotage and infiltration spread like wildfire. The illusion of German resurgence, powerful, organized, unstoppable, had returned, if only for a moment. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already appearing. The logistical nightmare of moving massive armored divisions through narrow, icy forest roads soon became apparent. Supply trucks lagged, tanks broke down, and bridges collapsed under the weight of armor. The further the Germans advanced, the more vulnerable their flanks became. Allied reinforcements were already on the move. General Patton was turning his Third Army north toward Bastogne, while airborne divisions prepared to hold key road junctions. The Germans had achieved surprise, but not victory. Time, fuel, and weather were all beginning to turn against them. As December 17th turned to the 18th, the reality of the offensive began to shift. The initial euphoria gave way to grim endurance. Many German soldiers, seeing their comrades frozen in the snow or burned in their tanks, began to question the promises of victory. The Ardennes was not yielding easily. It was swallowing men, machines, and dreams whole. And somewhere, deep within his headquarters in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler still believed the tide of war could be reversed. He did not yet realize that the Ardennes, his final gamble, would soon become the graveyard of the Reich's last hope. By December 19, 1944, the German spearheads were pushing deeper into Belgium, and their goal was clear: capture the crossroads town of Bastogne. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the roads that led to the Meuse River and beyond. The snow-covered forests surrounding the town became the stage for one of the most dramatic and heroic stands of the entire war. As the German 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel advanced, Bastogne stood in the way like a stone in the stream. Every major road in the Ardennes seemed to converge there, and if the Germans took it quickly, they could keep their momentum and reach the Meuse before the Allies regrouped. But the Americans were not about to let that happen. The defense of Bastogne would fall to the 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, hastily rushed in by truck and glider to hold the town at all costs. The paratroopers arrived cold, tired, and undersupplied. Many had been pulled out of rest camps in France, wearing summer uniforms without enough ammunition or food. Yet, as they trudged through the snow and mud into the encircled town, morale was high. They were the Screaming Eagles, elite soldiers forged in Normandy and Holland, and they understood the importance of what lay ahead. Bastogne had to hold. The weather turned brutal. Snowstorms and freezing fog choked the sky, grounding Allied aircraft and isolating the defenders. The surrounding woods echoed with artillery and machine gun fire as German tanks crept closer, probing the American lines. On December 20th, the town was completely surrounded. 7 roads led into Bastogne, and every one of them was cut off. The Americans were trapped. Inside the pocket, 11,000 paratroopers, tank destroyers, engineers, and remnants of other shattered units dug in among the ruins and snowbanks. They fortified cellars, set up roadblocks, and turned the town into a fortress. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition was rationed. Medical tents overflowed with wounded soldiers lying on frozen ground, covered with thin blankets. The temperatures dropped below 20 degrees C. Frostbite claimed almost as many men as the enemy's bullets. Outside the perimeter, the German commander Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz of the XL-Fevin Panzer Corps demanded surrender. On December 22, under a white flag, his envoys delivered an ultimatum. To the U.S. commander of Bastogne, the fortune of war is changing. The American forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. If this proposal is rejected, heavy artillery fire will begin, and the town will be completely destroyed. General McAuliffe read the message, paused, and then famously replied with a single word: "Nuts!" The envoys, puzzled, asked for clarification. The Americans explained, "It means go to hell." That defiant answer spread through the frozen trenches like wildfire. It became a rallying cry for every man holding the line. They knew they were outnumbered, cut off, and freezing. But they also knew surrender was not an option. The Germans launched repeated assaults. Panthers and Stooges rumbled through the snow, their turrets glowing orange in the winter dusk. Infantry advanced in waves, their white camouflage barely visible among the drifting snowflakes. American bazooka teams fired from basements and hedgerows, ambushing tanks at point-blank range. Machine guns rattled from church towers, each bullet carving defiance into the icy air. Bastogne became a battlefield of smoke, snow, and shattered stone. By December 23rd, the skies finally cleared. The weather that had favored the Germans now turned against them. The roar of engines filled the heavens. Allied transport planes appeared, dropping precious supplies by parachute. Medical packs, ammunition, and food rained down on the defenders. For the first time in days, hope returned. The soldiers cheered as they caught supply bundles drifting from the sky like Christmas gifts. Far to the south, General George S. Patton was already in motion. His Third Army had pivoted north in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war, racing through snow and ice to relieve Bastogne. Against all odds, Patton's tanks were closing in. The German offensive was losing momentum. Still, the battle raged on. German artillery shelled the town day and night, reducing Bastogne's buildings to rubble. Civilians huddled in basements, praying for survival. American medics worked without rest, performing amputations in candlelight, their breath visible in the freezing air. Supplies dwindled again, but morale did not break. The defenders of Bastogne became a symbol, proof that courage and stubborn will could withstand overwhelming force. Meanwhile, German commanders grew anxious. The delay at Bastogne was costing them precious time. Fuel reserves were nearly gone. Their armored spearheads, stretched thin across the narrow roads, were starving for gasoline. Without Bastogne, their supply lines were strangled. On Christmas Eve, 1944, German soldiers attacked once more, hoping to crush the town before Patton arrived. But they were met with fierce resistance. The paratroopers fought like ghosts among the ruins. The glow of tracer fire lit up the snow like a haunted battlefield. When dawn came, the German assault had failed again. Then, on December 26th, the sound of engines echoed through the frost. Patton's lead tanks from the 4th Armored Division broke through the German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was over. The defenders had held out for a week against overwhelming odds. As the wounded were evacuated and the snow fell quietly over the smoking ruins, McAuliffe sent a simple message to his men. The relief of Bastogne has been accomplished. The enemy failed to destroy us. We still hold Bastogne. The German dream of reaching the Meuse River was shattered. What was meant to be the turning point of the war had instead become a symbol of futility. The last offensive of the Third Reich had begun to unravel, and deep inside, the German commanders knew it. By the final week of December 1944, the Ardennes offensive had reached its critical point. What began as a surprise German breakthrough now threatened to collapse under its own weight. The initial shock and fury that had carried Hitler's divisions deep into Belgium were fading fast. The German spearheads, stretched thin, low on fuel, and facing increasing resistance, were no longer advancing. They were fighting just to hold on. The dream of splitting the Allied armies and forcing a negotiated peace was dying in the snow. In the beginning, the offensive had been built on illusion, an illusion of strength, coordination, and faith in a miracle. Hitler believed that, just as in 1940, boldness and surprise would compensate for the desperate condition of his forces. He had ignored the advice of his senior generals, including Guderian and Rundstedt, who had warned that Germany no longer had the resources for a major attack. The Reich's fuel depots were nearly empty, the Luftwaffe was crippled, and rail lines were constantly bombed by Allied planes. Yet Hitler demanded action. He needed a victory, not just for the war effort, but to restore his fading aura of invincibility. As December wore on, the reality on the ground grew grim. The weather, which had initially shielded the German advance from Allied air power, now began to clear. By December 23rd, the skies were open again, and with them came the relentless return of the Allied air forces. Thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, and Typhoon fighter bombers swept across the Ardennes, strafing columns of German armor trapped on narrow forest roads. Convoys burned, bridges collapsed, and tanks exploded one by one. For every German tank that reached the front, 2 were destroyed or abandoned. The American response grew stronger with each passing day. Reinforcements poured in from every direction. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, armored units from Patton's Third Army, and infantry regiments redeployed from quieter sectors. Eisenhower coordinated a massive counteroffensive from his headquarters, while Bradley and Patton worked to encircle the overextended German forces. The initial panic that had gripped the Allies in mid-December was replaced by determination and fury. For the German soldiers trapped in the snowy forests, the situation became desperate. Supplies ran out. Vehicles were immobilized by lack of fuel. Many units resorted to capturing American fuel trucks, but even those were soon depleted. Soldiers melted snow for drinking water and scavenged frozen rations from abandoned farms. Frostbite spread through the ranks like an invisible enemy, leaving men unable to hold their rifles. The once proud Wehrmacht was now an army of ghosts, trudging through the frozen woods with little more than blind obedience to drive them forward. Commanders on the ground began to see the futility. General von Manteuffel, a pragmatic and experienced officer, later recalled that he knew by December 24th the offensive had failed. His armored divisions, meant to reach the Meuse River, were bogged down and fighting simply to survive. The famed Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the spear of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had been cut off entirely. Surrounded near La Glaise, Peiper's men abandoned their tanks and fled on foot through the snow, leaving behind their once feared Tiger the Sehodin. Tanks. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility was visibly cracking. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence had finally pieced together the scale of the German attack. Ultra-intercepts confirmed that the offensive was indeed Hitler's final gamble, and that no major reserves existed behind it. The Allies now understood that if they could hold the line and counterattack effectively, they could destroy the last offensive capacity of the German army in the West. What had begun as a terrifying surprise now appeared as an opportunity, the chance to end the war faster. Morale among German troops began to sink. They had been promised victory, but instead found themselves retreating under constant bombardment. The promised Luftwaffe support never arrived. The skies were ruled by Allied fighters. Convoys were strafed from dawn till dusk. Even the famed German discipline began to erode. Reports of desertion, surrender, and looting increased. Soldiers burned their vehicles rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Officers destroyed maps and documents, realizing the end was inevitable. On the front lines, the once proud panzer divisions now moved more like hunted animals than hunters. Tanks ran out of fuel in the middle of combat, their crews forced to abandon them under fire. The haunting sight of Tiger tanks, frozen and empty, standing motionless in the snow, came to symbolize the death of the offensive. Still, Hitler refused to see the truth. From his command bunker, he ordered reinforcements that no longer existed. He raged at his generals, accusing them of cowardice and defeatism. When told that fuel shortages were crippling the offensive, he simply demanded that they capture more fuel. He believed that willpower alone could turn the tide of war, a tragic delusion that cost thousands of lives. On Christmas Day, American and German soldiers fought in the ruins of countless Ardennes villages. The frozen corpses of men and horses littered the fields. Burned-out vehicles marked every road. The once white snow was now black with soot and red with blood. Civilians cowered in cellars, listening to the ceaseless rumble of artillery and the whine of fighter-bombers above. By December 26th, Patton's forces had broken the siege of Bastogne, and the German momentum was officially broken. The Allies had regained the initiative. For the Germans, every step forward now meant retreat. Every victory turned into a trap. Every order to attack became an act of slow suicide. In the small command posts scattered through the Ardennes, German officers began to whisper what none dared say aloud. Der Krieg ist verloren. The war is lost. They could see it in the eyes of their men, in the empty fuel drums, in the skies filled with Allied planes. The last hope of the Reich, the hope that had driven them into the Ardennes with fire and faith, was dying in the cold Belgian winter. And yet, even as the realization spread, Hitler's propaganda continued to promise victory. Radio broadcasts spoke of heroic resistance, of a new Dunkirk for the Allies. But those listening at the front knew it was a lie. They had seen the truth, in the smoke, in the snow, and in the endless retreat that was now beginning. The tide had turned. The Ardennes, meant to be the place of Germany's rebirth, had become the symbol of its downfall. The Battle of the Bulge reached its most critical point in the small Belgian town of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other American units became surrounded by German forces. Bastogne's strategic importance was immense. It served as a vital road junction connecting 7 main routes in the Ardennes. Whoever controlled Bastogne could control the movement of men and supplies across the battlefield. The Germans knew this, and so did the Americans. For the Wehrmacht, capturing Bastogne was essential to sustaining the momentum toward Antwerp. For the Americans, holding it meant buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive and the counteroffensive to take shape. As snowstorms raged and temperatures plunged below freezing, Bastogne turned into a frozen fortress of defiance. On December 19, 1944, General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, received the grim news. His division, along with a handful of tank and artillery units, was completely encircled. The German lines pressed tightly around the town, cutting off all supply routes. Ammunition was low, medical supplies nearly gone, and food dwindled with each passing day. Yet the morale of the paratroopers remained astonishingly high. These were veterans of Normandy and Operation Market Garden, soldiers hardened by months of brutal combat. When the Germans sent a written demand for surrender, McAuliffe's reply became legendary: "Nuts!" It was a single word that captured the entire spirit of American resistance during the darkest days of the Ardennes. That defiant answer, passed around the foxholes and frozen streets, became a symbol of stubborn courage. The weather, however, was the true enemy of both sides. The snow was relentless, blanketing the forests and fields, grounding Allied aircraft that could have otherwise devastated the advancing German columns. For the men in Bastogne, the cold was a constant torment. Frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. Yet despite their misery, the defenders held on. Every attempt by the Germans to break through was repelled with ferocious determination. Infantry units fought from building to building, while American tank destroyers lurked in ambush, striking when enemy armor ventured too close. The siege became a test not only of tactics, but of endurance and spirit. As the days passed, the situation began to shift. The German offensive, so formidable in its opening days, was starting to lose momentum. Supply lines stretched thin, and fuel shortages crippled the panzers. The Allies, meanwhile, began to regroup. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered General George S. Patton to pivot his Third Army north toward Bastogne. In a maneuver that would become one of the most impressive feats of logistics in military history, Patton's divisions turned 90 degrees in freezing conditions and marched over 100 miles in just 2 days to relieve the besieged town. It was a bold and risky move, but one that demonstrated the flexibility and determination of the Allied command. On December 23rd, the skies finally cleared. For the first time in days, American aircraft roared over the Ardennes. C-47 transport planes dropped food, ammunition, and medical supplies into Bastogne, their parachutes dotting the white landscape like tiny blossoms of hope. P-47. Thunderbolts and typhoons strafed German positions, tearing through armored columns that had been advancing unchecked for days. The air supremacy that had defined Allied success throughout 1944 was once again reasserted. The German troops, who had relied on the cover of fog and snow, suddenly found themselves exposed and vulnerable. Patton's lead elements reached Bastogne on December 26th, breaking through the encirclement and bringing relief to the exhausted defenders. The men of the 101st Airborne, though battered and frostbitten, had held their ground. The German dream of seizing Bastogne, and with it the operational initiative in the Ardennes, was over. Yet the battle was far from finished. The fighting would continue into January, as both sides fought fiercely over every hill and crossroads. But the psychological momentum had shifted decisively. The Wehrmacht's last major offensive on the Western Front was now faltering, its forces bleeding strength they could no longer replace. The defense of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was a statement of willpower and resilience. In the snow-choked ruins, surrounded and outnumbered, American soldiers had demonstrated that morale could overcome even the most desperate odds. For the Germans, Bastogne became a symbol of their unraveling fortunes. Their meticulously planned operation, once brimming with confidence, was now bogged down by logistical failure, fierce resistance, and the unyielding tenacity of an enemy that refused to collapse. By the end of December, it was becoming clear even to the German high command that the tide had turned irreversibly. The Allies were regaining ground across the Ardennes, cutting off German units and reclaiming lost towns. The bulge that had threatened to split the Allied front was shrinking by the day. What had begun as Hitler's grand gamble now looked increasingly like a disaster. And for the soldiers still fighting amid the forests and frozen villages, Bastogne stood as proof that the Ardennes, once thought to be the grave of the Allied advance, would instead become the grave of the Wehrmacht's final hopes in the West. By the dawn of January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had become an emblem not of German brilliance, but of German desperation. What began with the thunder of artillery and the roar of panzers now echoed with retreat, destruction, and the hollow sound of boots crunching through snow as the remnants of Hitler's final army trudged back toward Germany. The dream of splitting the Allied lines and forcing a negotiated peace was dead. In its place lay the smoking wreckage of a once proud Wehrmacht, crushed under the combined weight of Allied air power, superior logistics, and the relentless advance of men who knew victory was within reach. Hitler refused to accept defeat, demanding that every position be held, every soldier fight to the last bullet. But the battlefield no longer obeyed his will. Fuel shortages crippled the tanks that had once spearheaded the offensive. Entire panzer divisions were immobilized, their crews forced to abandon vehicles worth millions in favor of a desperate trek on foot. The Ardennes forests, once envisioned as a path to glory, had become a graveyard of steel and men. The American counterattack had grown in strength and precision. Patton's Third Army, moving with astonishing speed through the southern flank, liberated Bastogne and began pushing eastward. From the north, Montgomery coordinated a series of offensives that gradually compressed the German salient, squeezing it like a vice. By mid-January, the once ambitious Bulge was shrinking daily, collapsing inward under unrelenting artillery and airstrikes. The Luftwaffe attempted one last show of strength. Operation Bodenplatte, a massive New Year's Day air raid intended to destroy Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. It achieved tactical surprise, but at an unbearable cost. Hundreds of German aircraft were lost, many with their veteran pilots. The Luftwaffe never recovered, leaving German ground forces utterly exposed to Allied air supremacy. The human toll was staggering. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the forests and villages they had fought so fiercely to seize only weeks before. Units like the 2nd Panzer Division and the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend were decimated beyond repair. The Waffen-SS, which had fought with fanatical determination, found itself outnumbered, outgunned, and encircled. Even the infamous Kampfgruppe Peiper, responsible for the Malmedy massacre, was reduced to a handful of exhausted survivors who abandoned their vehicles and escaped on foot. Meanwhile, Allied forces faced their own brutal losses, more than 80,000 casualties in the Ardennes alone. The Battle of the Bulge became the bloodiest engagement fought by the United States during World War II. Yet amid the horror, it also revealed the resilience and adaptability of the Allied army. Soldiers who had been ambushed and routed in the first days of the attack regrouped, fought back, and eventually turned the tide. For Germany, the failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the irreversible end of the Third Reich's military capability. The resources expended in the Ardennes could never be replaced. Tanks, fuel, and men all had been consumed in a battle that offered no strategic gain. Within weeks, the Soviets launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive in the east, sweeping across Poland and breaking into Germany itself. Hitler's obsession with the West had fatally weakened his eastern defenses. By February 1945, the Western Allies were crossing the Rhine. By April, Soviet troops were storming Berlin. The gamble of December 1944, meant to save the Reich, had instead hastened its collapse. In retrospect, the Ardennes offensive stands as one of the most tragic and futile episodes in modern warfare. It was a testament to the fading brilliance of German military tactics and the growing insanity of Nazi leadership. The men who fought there, on both sides, endured unimaginable suffering in a landscape of snow, fire, and steel. The frozen fields of Belgium became the final proving ground of Hitler's delusions and the crucible of Allied determination. When the last German troops withdrew across the Rhine, leaving behind their dead and their dreams, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The day the Germans realized the Ardennes was lost was not merely the end of a battle. It was the end of a vision. The Reich had gambled everything and lost, and in its defeat lay the beginning of liberation for a continent, and the closing act of the most destructive war in human history.